October 7, 2023. While Israel celebrates the day of its Festival of Huts, the armed group Nunca launches the largest operation in its history, crossing from Gaza into Israel with more than 1,000 armed fighters. Strangely enough, the defensive wall is breached and the Israeli army is caught with almost no presence in the area. The invasion of Nunca ends in an unprecedented massacre with about 13 people killed and 250 taken to Gaza as hostages. After this, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu declares a state of war, something that has not happened since 1973. In his speech, they promised to end Nunca once and for all. But between the Israeli army and Nunca lies the Gaza Strip, which is home to 2.3 million civilians, who have nothing to do with the conflict and behind whom Nunca hides tunnels underground. Israel bombs and invades Gaza, killing 12,000 civilians in 5 weeks. Fighting is concentrated in the north of the Strip, causing 1 million Palestinians to flee to the south. This is the story of the current conflict between Israel, Palestine, and Arab nations and how it has remained alive for more than 75 years. But if we have to start at the beginning, its roots must be sought 3,000 years ago in about 15 hectares of the old city of Jerusalem. The origin of this conflict stems from a religious difference between Muslims and Jews. In principle, both religions are based on the person of Abraham, who appears in the Old Testament or Torah. The difference lies when in said book God asks Abraham to sacrifice one of his sons to demonstrate his loyalty. For the Jews, Abraham chooses to sacrifice Isaac, and for the Muslims he chooses Ishmael. The origin of the conflict lies in this difference. In both stories, however, God can see Abraham's loyalty and warns that it is not necessary to kill his son. This failed sacrifice took place on Mount Moriah, the place where the Hebrew king Solomon built his temple in 957 BC. This temple, where various deities came to be worshipped, was destroyed by the Babylonians in 600 BC and was rebuilt a few decades later and renovated by King Herod. In 70 AD, this temple was destroyed by the Roman legions of Titus during the war unleashed by the Roman occupation. The current Wailing Wall is the only thing that remains of Herod's temple that was destroyed by the Romans. In this war against Rome, almost 1 million Jews were killed and some 100,000 were captured and enslaved. It was at this time of war with the Roman Empire that the Jews were expelled from this area, dispersing them throughout the world, an event known as the Great Diaspora. Once the Western Roman Empire had come to an end and the Jews had disappeared from the area, around the year 600, a successful merchant claimed to have had a divine revelation and began to spread what is now known as Islam. This man was Muhammad, and his followers knew him as the last of the prophets, since he claimed to be the heir of Abraham, Moses, and Jesus of Nazareth. With great skill and evident magnetism, Muhammad managed to start a powerful movement that in just a century dominated the area and spread throughout North Africa and present-day Spain, which was baptized as Al-Andalus. With their new interpretation of the Hebrew books, Muslims built the Mosque of the Rock and the Mosque of Al-Aqsa in honor of Muhammad. These were on the same site as the ancient Hebrew Temple of Solomon on Mount Moriah. In this way, one of the holiest places for Muslims was built on one of the holiest places for Jews. The Arab-Israeli conflict had just begun, with Jerusalem at its epicenter. Muslims, taking advantage of the Jewish exile, predominated in the area, building these mosques and converting the inhabitants to Islam. This predominance was consolidated by the Ottoman Empire, also Muslim, which dominated the area from 1300 to 1918. During these centuries, the Jewish population would be persecuted in the kingdoms of France, Germany, England, and the Spanish Empire. Because of this, the Jews settled mainly in Amsterdam, Poland, and Russia, where they developed in relative tranquility. Despite being far away, the Jews never resigned themselves to returning to their homeland, toasting during the festivities under the phrase, "Next year in Jerusalem." This desire to return was consolidated in 1896 with the creation of Zionism, a movement that sought to create a Jewish state in the Jerusalem area and its surroundings. This movement would be supported by the wealthiest Jewish families, such as the Rothschild dynasty, one of the most powerful families of the time. Driven by Zionism and also fleeing anti-Semitism in Russia, tens of thousands of Jews began to settle in the region at the beginning of the 20th century. In November 1917, British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour issued a document acknowledging that the English Crown supported the creation of a national home for Jews in the region of Palestine. This statement was addressed to Lionel Waterroth and signified the support of a major power for the Zionist project to create Israel. By 1918, fortune began to smile on the Hebrews. World War I had dealt the final blow to the Ottoman Empire, and now Palestine and Jerusalem were under the rule of Great Britain. Under the British Mandate, Jewish immigration to Palestine and the purchase of land by Jews and Jewish organizations in the area increased greatly, causing Palestinian Muslims to become increasingly angry, leading to an uprising in 1936 that would cause more than 5,000 Palestinian deaths. The Great Jewish Immigration to Palestine, however, took place with the Nazi regime dominating Europe, and after its fall, at the end of World War II and the horror of the massacre perpetrated by the Germans exposed, hundreds of thousands of Jewish survivors wandered aimlessly among the ruins of what were once their homes and tried to return to their ancestral land. Thousands were stopped on the way to Palestine and interned in camps in Cyprus. Illegal immigration from Europe and other places became uncontrollable for the British, who imposed restrictions on entry and the sale of land. In 1946, however, there were already 600,000 Jews and 1,300,000 Muslim Arabs living in Palestine. In September 1947, the British government, pressured by the conflict situation, announced its intention to renounce its mandate in Palestine, for which the solution was submitted to the UN General Assembly. In November of that year, the UN approved Resolution 181 with the support of the United States and the USSR, which recommended dividing Palestine into two states, one Arab and one Jewish, and placing Jerusalem and its surroundings under international control. Islamic countries, however, voted against this resolution. The complexity of the issue was clear, since the Jews were demanding a return to an ancestral land from which they had been expelled 2,000 years earlier. And the Arabs intended to retain a land in which they had lived for 1,300 years. By May 1948, Zionist leader David Ben-Gurion declared independence and the creation of the State of Israel with immediate recognition from the United States and the Soviet Union. The Palestinians inside the territory opposed this, and clashes arose between Muslims and Jews. That same day, the country was invaded by overwhelmingly superior armies from Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, among others. At first, the Arabs dominated the situation, putting Jerusalem under siege, but as the weeks went by, the Israelis organized themselves and mounted a very strong defense despite their small population compared to the Arab population. After almost a year of fighting, an armistice agreement was reached in 1949. Under this agreement, the Jordanians managed to take control of Cisjordan and Old Jerusalem, leaving the Temple Mount in their hands. Egypt, on the other hand, settled for annexing the Gaza Strip. Israel, however, increased its territory by 6,000 square kilometers and managed to consolidate its independence despite being surrounded by enemies. As for the Palestinian state, it could not be formed because the territories assigned by the UN were occupied by Egypt, Jordan, and Israel. By the end of this war, approximately 700,000 Palestinians left their homes seeking refuge, and an equivalent number of Jews expelled from Arab countries settled in Israel, doubling its population. Around 1952, Egyptian military man Gamal Abdel Nasser participated in a coup d'état that ended with him being crowned president 2 years later. Nasser had fought against Israel 6 years earlier and was a strong advocate of Pan-Arabism, a movement that sought to unite all Arab nations under the same banner. Under the tutelage of Nasser's Egypt and Syria, the Palestine Liberation Organization, or better known as the PLO, was created, which sought to reclaim the failed Palestinian state. The political group known as Fatah, led by Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat, was also formed. This party, unlike the PLO, which was controlled by Egypt, was independent and proposed a Palestinian solution by separating itself from its Arab neighbors. With the creation of these groups and Nasser's aggressive policy towards Israel, war was only a matter of time. On May 17, 1967, Egyptian leader Gamal Nasser demanded that the UN Secretary-General immediately withdraw international forces from the Sinai Peninsula. This UN emergency force had been established on the peninsula and in the Suez Canal area in 1957, following Egypt's conflict with England and France over control of the canal, and it still remained on Egypt's border with Israel as the only guarantee of peace. A few days later, Egypt blocked the Straits of Tiran to Israeli ships, blocking Jewish access to the Red Sea. Israel took this directly as an act of war, putting its armed forces on alert. The situation continued to escalate, as Nazar became increasingly aggressive and belligerent. In a speech by Clara, she said, "We feel strong enough to go to war with Israel with God's help. Our goal is to destroy Israel." Quote. Her popularity increased. Nationalist hysteria swept the Arab world, and from Algeria to Iraq, everyone supported the war. The Arab masses in all the capitals of the Middle East demonstrated in the streets, demanding that Nazar call for war and the elimination of the Jewish state forever. Nazar felt at the height of his popularity and intended to take advantage of it. A few days later, military defense pacts were signed between Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq, with the impending war with Israel in mind. The young state of Israel, with a small army and civilian reserves, faced the threat of four surrounding Arab countries, with the material and human support of the rest of the Arab world: Yemen, Cuba, Algeria, Sudan, and Lebanon, which publicly declared that their goal was the destruction of the Jewish state. With its fewer than 50,000 soldiers, its reservists, and a few tanks, Israel found itself surrounded by almost 500,000 Arab soldiers and 2,500 tanks, while its air force consisted of barely 260 planes facing off against some 500 Arab planes. In the following hours, Israeli intelligence learned that the Arabs were preparing to attack. And this time, unlike the 1948 war, with direct support from the Soviet Union, on June 5, 1967, at 7:45 in the morning, the Jewish state, led by the prudent Prime Minister Levi Skol, anticipated the Arab attack and launched Operation Focus, launching a surprise airstrike on Egypt before Jordan and Syria could react. The operation initially targeted Egyptian airfields, seeking to destroy aircraft on the ground as well as infrastructure, runways, hangars, barracks, radars, and anti-aircraft batteries. 7:45 in the morning was the precise time chosen by Israeli intelligence, which had determined that this was the time the first patrols of the day were returning. Some of the personnel were having breakfast and the fog over the Nile Delta was dissipating, improving visibility. The initial attack consisted of 184 aircraft approaching in low-level flight under Egyptian radar and dropping their anti-runway bombs, which created craters and caused a slope, making it impossible for Egyptian aircraft to take off. After destroying the runways, the more than 300 Egyptian aircraft were destroyed while on the ground and unable to defend themselves. After 3 lightning waves, Egypt had lost 20 airfields and almost all of its combat aircraft. On the Egyptian side, Egypt's second-in-command and future president Anwar al-Sadat walked to headquarters, thinking about the imminent attack he and his neighbors were planning against Israel. Suddenly he saw columns of smoke on the horizon, assuming that the Egyptian attack had already begun. Upon arriving at headquarters, he found President Gamal Nasser slumped in his armchair. Nasser tells his lieutenant, "Awar, we have lost our entire air force." Only a few hours had passed and Israeli supremacy in the air was absolute, which would allow enormous advantages in the fight on the ground. But the Israeli offensive did not stop with this attack, but spread to the center, south, and north. On the third day of the war, the elite paratroopers were ordered to occupy the old city of Jerusalem. That day, the Wailing Wall and the Temple Mount returned to Israeli control after 2,000 years. In the Sinai region, Israel and Egypt faced each other in one of the most important mechanized battles of the post-war period. The Israeli victory in a few days was complete, reaching all the way to the Suez Canal. Nasser would later admit that the entire Egyptian army was committed and that there were no reserve troops between the canal and the Cairo. With the Egyptian front secured, Israel focused on occupying the Golan Heights. From there, Syria threatened the Sea of Galilee, Israel's most fertile area and its supply chain, water supply in the country. The victory is complete again. The Syrian army must abandon the heights and retreat to defend Damascus. Israel to this day occupies these elevated positions that provide a strategic buffer to its geography. The State of Israel, in a complete and devastating victory, manages to occupy the entire Sinai Peninsula, the Golan Heights, the Gaza Strip, Cisjordan and the old part of Jerusalem. These conquests give the Israelis what is called strategic depth. That is, territories that allow them to move the enemy's border away from their main cities, providing a cushion of terrain against possible threats. But these lands are also inhabited by Palestinians who are not happy with the State of Israel and who see how the Palestinian state promised by the UN in 1948 is moving further and further away. Since its victory in 1967, Israel also begins a policy of installing Jewish settlements in the conquered territories that were supposed to form part of the Palestinian state. This will in the future mean the fragmentation of the Palestinian state and will be condemned by international law. On the other hand, despite the strong defeat, the Arab countries doubled down and after the 7-Day War they adopted the Hardem Resolution, known as the Three No's Resolution. They signed a no to the recognition of Israel, no to negotiations with Israel and no to peace with Israel, leaving a scenario of imminent revenge for the lost war and ensuring more conflict for the future. Also after the war, the PLO ceased to be under Egyptian control and was in Palestinian hands under the leadership of Yasser Arafat. From 1969, Arafat would be the representative of Palestine to the world, leading the PLO and within it the political group Fatah. By March 1969, the leader of the Labour Party, Golda Meir, was appointed Prime Minister of Israel. She was born in Ukraine and had come to the Middle East fleeing the pogroms in Russia, becoming one of the founders of the Jewish state along with Ben-Gurion. By 1970, changes in political leadership occurred almost simultaneously in Egypt and Syria. On the one hand, she died of Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser dies of cardiac arrest and is replaced by Vice President Anwar al-Sadat, who was closer to the west than he was born. On the other hand, in Syria, the intransigent Hafez al-Assad, who was close to the Soviets and who was intransigent to any agreement with Israel, took de facto power. Despite his death from birth, the Arab defeat led to the radicalization of the PLO and its different factions. This was reflected in the Munich massacre that occurred in 1972, when a group of Palestinians kidnapped the Israeli Olympic team in the Olympic Village. Germany refused to allow Israeli forces to rescue them and tried to rescue the athletes itself, which ended in the death of 11 athletes and 5 terrorists. Despite the tragedy, the Olympic Games were held anyway under the slogan, "The Games must go on." And to make matters worse, the 3 terrorists who were imprisoned managed to be released after the PLO took over a Lufthansa plane as a method of extortion. After the release of these 3 terrorists, Israel responded with Operation Wrath of God, commissioned by the Mossad, under which the participants in the attack were assassinated in different parts of the world. After this episode, another even more serious one took place, the Yom Kippur War of 1973. In September of that year, the Israeli government of Golda Meir received intelligence alerts about the imminence of the Egyptian attack. After coming and going, the Prime Minister ended up putting the Israeli forces on alert, although she refused to carry out a preventive attack like the one in 1967. Meir did not want Israel to be seen as the aggressor on the international stage. October 6, 1973, Egypt and Syria launch a massive attack on Israel. It is the holiest day for Judaism, the pure junkie day of forgiveness, a full religious holiday and also the Muslim holy month of Ramadan. Muslim leaders approved the attack as a holy war. Egypt attacks in the Sinai Desert and Syria in the Golan Heights, territories conquered by Israel in the 1967 war. Jordan, for its part, does not take part in this war and remains on the sidelines. The Israeli defense minister, Moshe Dayan, places his full confidence in the Barlet defensive line, which runs along the Suez Canal with trenches and forts facing Egypt, claiming that it is the most powerful anti-tank defense in the world. But the Egyptian army begins the all-out attack with a major bombardment and artillery strikes on the line and the Israeli bases in Sinai. Also protected by a smokescreen, rubber boats are launched to transport Egyptian commandos to the other side of the canal. By October 7th, Egyptian beachheads are established at several points along an important stretch of the canal. Egypt then builds Soviet-made articulated floating bridges across the waters of the canal for the armored vehicles to cross. The Barlet line fails to contain the Egyptian onslaught that surprises it. The attack seems unstoppable. The batteries of modern, highly mobile anti-aircraft missiles, the missiles, anti-tank missiles, and the latest generation of Soviet RPG rocket launchers surprise the Israelis. The Jews were part of their air force for a large part of the defense strategy, but they were faced with the shield of the SAM rockets protecting the Egyptian troops and armor. October 8, 1973. The situation became extremely complicated. Israel faced the eventual defeat against two armies that had surprised it, especially on the southern front. Egypt and Syria, heavily supplied with military equipment by the Soviet Union, tripled Israel's troops and doubled its armored vehicles and combat aircraft. Faced with the eventual defeat, President Golda Meir desperately asked the United States for help. By October 11th, Israel managed to stabilize the Syrian front in the Golan Heights, and the strong counteroffensive took it to the original border before the war. Once again, as in 1967, columns of Israeli armor occupied the city of Quneitra and reached the outskirts of Damascus. The airspace on the northern front was completely controlled, and Syria is practically defeated with its capital Damascus in danger. Starting on October 12th, Israel begins to receive, by order of President Nixon, a huge amount of military aid from the United States under Operation Nickel Crass. With the support of the United States, the Arab countries are supported by OPEC, formed by Iran, Venezuela, and Saudi Arabia, which decides to restrict oil production and apply an embargo to the countries that support Israel, especially the United States and Western Europe. This generates a global energy crisis, causing shortages in many Western countries. Syrian President Faisal al-Assad, despairing of imminent defeat and with the Israelis at the gates of Damascus, asks Egypt to intensify its attack on the Sinai Peninsula to distract the Jewish forces. President Anwar el-Sadat commits the reserves and orders, against the advice of his entire general staff, the advance into Sinai. The Egyptians then enter Sinai and move away from the security provided by their beachheads on the banks of the canal with their missile shields, anti-aircraft batteries, and artillery. At this moment, a huge battle of armored vehicles takes place. Egyptian T-55 and T-62 tanks of Soviet manufacture face the Old Man and modified M48 patterns together with the M60s and the English Centurions. The Israeli victory is complete and the battle takes place in the desert setting in full view of the wrecked tanks that had been there since the 1967 war. The defeat of the Egyptians is due in part to the Israeli tactical superiority and to the fact that by moving away from the beachheads of the canal to enter the Sinai, they lost the protection of their SAM missile shields. After this battle, Israel manages to stabilize the front and then cross the Suez Canal through a gap in the Egyptian lines north of the Bitter Lake, entering deep into Egyptian territory. By the end of October, Egypt is practically defeated and the UN calls for a ceasefire. This call finds Israel surrounding the Syrian capital of Damascus and firmly established in territory Egypt, cutting off the road linking Cairo with the city of Suez. Israel is far from satisfied and continues its offensive, approaching Egypt's Third Army. The URSS threatens to directly support Egypt if Israel does not stop its attack. Tensions escalate to very high levels between the URSS and the United States until Israel finally ceases its offensive. It is the end of the Yom Kippur War. Egypt and Syria have suffered a new and resounding defeat, suffering 4 or 5 times more casualties than the Israeli forces. A true disaster. 3 years after the war, an attack takes place that will go down in history. An Air France commercial plane with 248 passengers is hijacked by 4 Palestinian and German terrorists. The plane is diverted to Libya and finally to Entebbe Airport in Uganda. In the heart of Africa, the hijackers crowd the hostages at the airport and demand the release of Palestinian terrorists detained in Israel and Kenya. Later, the non-Israeli passengers are released, but the Israelis are held captive while the negotiations. Israel gains time with negotiations while preparing the difficult rescue mission almost 4,000 kilometers away. Under the codename Operation Thunder, 29 elite commandos are sent by plane flying at very low altitude. The commandos storm the airport where the hostages are being held and open fire on 100 Ugandan soldiers and 7 terrorists. After 30 minutes of high tension and crossfire, the special forces leave 45 Hungarians and the terrorists dead, but also kill 3 hostages who had stopped in the middle of the confrontation. In addition to this, they destroy 11 MiG houses, 17 of which belonged to Uganda and were standing there. The Israeli army, for its part, loses only 1 soldier, Colonel Jonathan Netanyahu, brother of the current prime minister. The 100 surviving hostages are sent to Israel and are received by their families with great media coverage. Returning to the general context, around 1977, the Egyptian leader El-Sadat finally becomes convinced of the need for a lasting peace with Israel, making a trip to Tel Aviv and proposing an agreement in the Hebrew parliament. This agreement was signed in 1978 and is known as the Sitavit Accords. Under this agreement, Israel is formally recognized by Egypt and in exchange withdraws from Sinai, ceding it to the government in Cairo. Israel also agrees to establish an autonomous regime in Gaza and Cisjordan for the Palestinians. This agreement ends a 30-year conflict between Israel and Egypt forever. Syria, on the other hand, will not attack Israel again, which remains in possession of the Golan Heights. But although the 1978 agreements represent progress, violence between Arabs and Israelis continues to be latent. Around 1982, Israel launches Operation Peace for Galilee, in which it invades southern Lebanon to eliminate extremist groups of the PLO, which was led by Yasser Arafat. This invasion results in the expulsion of the PLO from Lebanon, but at a very high price, with massacres of civilians on both sides. The most significant incident is known as the Sabrea and Satala massacre, where the Phalanx and Christian Vanessa killed between 1,000 and 3,000 people. The Israeli army is indirectly held responsible for being in charge of these camps and for having done nothing to prevent the massacre. With the PLO's withdrawal from the area, the Palestinians living in Israel are left to their own devices and gradually begin to grow irritable with the living conditions. Although Gaza and Cisjordan were to be for a new Palestinian regime, as stipulated in the 1978 agreements, Israel constantly establishes its own settlements in the form of small towns, after which it sends Jewish civilians and diverts resources such as water and food to the detriment of the Palestinians. By 1987, there were 125 settlements in Cisjordan and 18 in Gaza. This constant Israeli presence in what was supposed to be Palestinian land according to the agreement, generates constant unrest and a fragmentation of the Palestinian territory. This, combined with high unemployment, overcrowding, restrictions on the movement of goods, and the lack of food and water, is a major cause of the Palestinian conflict. Free movement and some clashes caused the situation to explode. From one day to the next, thousands of young Palestinians rise up against the Israeli occupation in what is known as the First Intifada. With little more than stones and sticks, the Palestinians confront the Israeli forces in the streets of multiple cities. The Israeli government is unprepared for this revolt and responds with firearms, as was customary in the 19th century. The streets turn into a bloodbath, with a total of 14 Palestinian deaths and 93 Israelis between 1987 and 1993. This uprising threatens Israel's structure over Palestine and leads to the emergence of several political groups, including the famous Hamas. As contradictory as it may seem, it was never created with the help of the State of Israel. The story begins in the 1970s when Israel begins financing several Islamic groups in Gaza with the aim of weakening Yasser Arafat's PLO command. The idea was to divide the Palestinians in order to be able to control them better. One of those receiving financing would be the creator of Jamaat. This man is Ahmed Yassin, a quadriplegic and semi-blind Muslim priest who leads the Mohammed al-Islam group, with which he builds mosques, schools and even the Islamic University of Gaza. Israel allows all these works and allows Yassin to gain increasing relevance with the aim of later confronting Yasser Arafat and the PLO. But Yassin turns his back on Israel, and during the first uprising he founds his paramilitary branch under the name of Jamaat, which does not recognize Israel as a legitimate state. The works carried out by Yassin allow him to control half of the mosques in Gaza, which are used as bases to hide military equipment and operations. The priest becomes the spiritual leader of the armed group, and thanks to his popularity among the Palestinians, it is never able to prosper very quickly. But while this is happening, in November 1988, Yasser Arafat takes advantage of the conflict to officially proclaim the State of Palestine, which is recognized by 94 countries at that time. In this way, the PLO remains the official representative of Palestine, facing the world. But despite this, Arafat is forced to negotiate due to international events. With the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, the PLO, Syria and Iraq stopped receiving military support from Moscow. This, coupled with the US victory in Cuba, prompted Arafat to begin peace talks with Israel. In September 1993, the PLO, represented by Mahmoud Abbas and Yasser Arafat, signed the Oslo Accords with the Israeli government, under which Israel recognized the PLO as the representative of Palestine and the PLO recognized the State of Israel as legitimate. According to this agreement, Jordan was divided into three areas: A, B and C. Both areas A and B were under Palestinian civilian control and represented 40% of the territory, with 3 million Palestinians living there. The other 60% fell within Area A, which was controlled by Israel, and included Israeli cities, roads and military bases. This division led to the area being seen as a mix of different areas, some Palestinian and some Israeli. An important detail is that Israel controls the crossings between the Palestinian areas, and can isolate any area at any time. This arrangement was supposed to be temporary and would be resolved within 5 years. But that never happened, and to this day everything continues in the same way. To add fuel to the fire, Israel continued to establish settlements in the Palestinian territory of Cisjordan despite the Oslo Accords and despite going against international law. After 6 years of back and forth, in July 2000, President Bill Clinton summoned Ejid Barak for Israel and Yasser Arafat for Palestine. They discussed and tried to close a definitive treaty that would end the conflict once and for all, but it was not possible, and they issued a resolution that did not satisfy either party. Barely 2 months later, the then leader of the Israeli opposition, Ariel Sharon, visited the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. This visit was interpreted as a very serious provocation by the Palestinian population and caused some incidents and minor clashes between the two parties. These and the security forces. However, the following day, during the Friday prayer and with the tension between both populations increasing, hundreds of young Muslims stoned the Jewish worshippers gathered in front of the Wailing Wall from the esplanade of the mosques. The Israeli police responded by firing live ammunition, killing 7 Palestinians on the spot and causing the incidents to spread throughout the Arab part of Jerusalem. The Second Intifada was beginning. Soon, the streets of the cities were filled with clashes between the Israeli army and young Palestinians, many of them minors. At this time, suicide attacks began to take place against shopping malls, restaurants, or bus stations. For its part, Israel resorted to the execution without trial of possible suspects, as well as the occupation of Palestinian territories. In 2002, construction of a wall separating Jordan and Gaza from its territory began. In March 2004, the leader of Hamas Ahed Yassin was assassinated as he returned from praying in his mosque by 3 rockets as he was returning from praying in his mosque, dropped by an Israeli helicopter. His funeral was attended by 200,000 people and he became a martyr for Islam and for Palestinians in general. Also in November of that year, the other Palestinian leader, Yasser Arafat, died in a strange way. According to some sources, Arafat was gradually poisoned with polonium-210 by the Israeli Secret Service. This was confirmed by Israeli journalist Ronen Bergman himself in his book Rise and Kill First in 2018. After 2 years of daily violence, the second uprising gradually died down until it ended in 2005 with Israel's withdrawal from the Gaza Strip and northern Cisjordan. In this way, Gaza was fully controlled by the Palestinians, who held general elections in January 2006. In these elections, he never obtained 44% of the votes, compared to 41% for the Fatah group, so tempers soon became heated. He never denounces Israel for imprisoning several of his candidates and, on the other hand, Fatah does not recognize the victory of Never. This causes Palestine to separate into 2 distinct groups. On the one hand, Cisjordan, governed by Fatah, and on the other hand, the Gaza Strip, governed by Never. Never, who is settled in Gaza, does not recognize the legitimacy of the State of Israel, nor does he accept the UN resolution of 1948, which established the partition of Palestine into 2 states, one Arab and one Jewish. On the other hand, Fatah Jordan has a policy of recognition towards Israel, but is in dispute over Israeli settlements in its territory. Since 1967, Israel has gradually occupied 61% of the Palestinian territory of Cisjordan with towns and military bases and also has absolute control of the routes and accesses to the country, leaving the Palestinians living in a giant prison. This has been condemned by the UN and by international law, but has never been resolved. Worse still, President Benjamin Netanyahu has proposed annexing the entire territory as part of Israel in a definitive way. Returning to the Gaza Strip, since its withdrawal in 2005, Israel has closed Gaza off from the world by land and air, leaving only 3 points of trade, which are controlled by its army, thus suffocating the Palestinians commercially. It has never taken advantage of this blockade to present itself as the protective father of the Gazans, carrying out all kinds of social actions in schools and hospitals, which has increased its popularity. In addition to this, it has responded by buying weapons and building underground tunnels that cross into Egypt underground in order to be able to trade. This situation ends up exploding when Egypt also closes its border with Gaza to prevent it from ever invading and contaminating its internal politics. A few months after this, it never blew up part of the Egyptian wall, causing 500,000 inhabitants of Gaza to cross the country in search of food, fuel and medicine. In just 5 days, migrants spent $250 million. The flood of Palestinians crossing into Egypt en masse exposes Israel's abuse of its trade blockade, which was strangling 1.5 million people. For its part, Israel excuses itself by saying that it had fired 4,000 rockets in the previous months, and towards the end of 2008 it carries out a direct invasion with thousands of troops. In this invasion of Gaza, Israel attempts to destroy some bases and rocket batteries, but after 3 weeks it must withdraw. This incursion, however, leaves 100 Palestinians dead, 50,000 displaced people homeless, and only 13 Israelis dead, in addition to destroying hospitals, farms, and dozens of factories, generating a major crisis in the Strip. This scenario would repeat itself in 2014, when Israel kidnaps and murders 3 Israeli teenagers. In response, Israel carries out a military incursion that ends up killing 2 Palestinian children who were in the area. This situation ends up leading to a general escalation where Israel bombs and invades Gaza and never fires thousands of rockets into Israeli territory. This scenario ends with very sad episodes such as the murder of 4 children who were playing on the beach and were attacked by the Israeli Navy. It also leads to the bombing of schools and hospitals where it never hid missile ammunition. Israeli forces, both in 2014 and today, before attacking these places, usually warn those who are there by means of pamphlets or phone calls. Then it carries out a light attack to warn of the imminent bombing, and after 10 minutes the bombs are dropped on the target. Despite this, the 2014 incursion caused the death of 16 civilians in Gaza and some 400,000 displaced people due to the lack of water and electricity. On Israel's side, 5 civilians and 66 professional soldiers died. It would never have suffered 600 deaths among its ranks. After 50 days of conflict, thanks to Egyptian mediation, the parties agreed to an indefinite truce. After this, violence would erupt again in May 2023, when the Palestinian Jihad and other groups confronted Israel in an exchange of missiles and rockets that ended with the Jihad's top brass being neutralized by Israeli special forces. But the latest episode of this conflict is still unfolding, being an all-out war between Nunca and the Israeli army. This war began on October 7, 2023, when Nunca announced its Operation Storm Al-Aqsa, after which it launched 5,000 rockets in 20 minutes against Israel and began a ground offensive unprecedented in the history of the conflict. After the rockets, the attack began with the sending of bomb drones that destroyed Israeli outposts near the border. This allowed hundreds of guerrillas to cross into Israel by paraglider, and moments later Nunca smelled the defensive wall at several points. Within minutes, hundreds of terrorists on motorcycles and vans sneak through these gaps and advance on the nearby towns. Barely 2 hours later, the Israeli Army High Command reports that the terrorists have taken over the military bases closest to the border, including the base of the 43rd Firefox Division, also known as the Gaza Division. In this area, the terrorists burst into an electronic music festival near the base, killing 364 people, while on the general front, some 250 civilians are taken hostage into Gaza. Surprisingly, Israeli forces respond clumsily and slowly, with only a few assault helicopters arriving in the area an hour after the attack began. The guerrillas are never killed by Israeli reinforcements, although some manage to escape back into Gaza. The world is in shock. It is incomprehensible how Israeli intelligence could not have discovered such an armed operation and how it could have been successful. The IDF, or Israeli Defense Forces, has the second largest military budget in the world per capita, in addition to 170,000 soldiers active at all times from different branches. With this, it is very hard to believe that they could not have stopped 1,000 militiamen on motorcycles and paragliders at a border barely 50 kilometers long. Following these events, the Israeli government led by Netanyahu declares a state of war and promises a response unlike anything seen on television. This response begins with a total blockade of the Gaza Strip, cutting off electricity and blocking the entry of food and fuel. The Israel Electric Corporation, which supplies 80% of the electricity to the Strip, cuts off the power supply to the area, leaving 2 million people in the dark and without running water. This is followed by a fierce bombardment that lasts 20 days throughout the entire strip, destroying key points of no return, but also killing thousands of civilians in between. Chaos reigns in Gaza, where Palestinians search in the dark day after day for something to eat while enduring the daily bombings. The guerrillas of Nablus take refuge inside the enormous complex of tunnels they have dug under Gaza while accusing Israel of having started the escalation of violence. After 20 days of bombing, the Israeli army cuts off the internet and telephone signal throughout Gaza and carries out an invasion of the northern part, confronting Nablus face to face. Around 1.5 million Palestinians flee from northern Gaza to the south, almost completely emptying the northern part and causing chaos due to overcrowding in the south. Starting on October 31st, ground fighting intensifies along with the bombings. Civilians who choose not to evacuate the area are prey to chaos and destruction, being attacked in every imaginable situation. Even an ambulance is attacked by an Israeli missile, killing 15 people in the process. Israeli forces claim that the ambulance was used by Hamas, although they do not provide evidence of this. The Jabalia refugee camp is also attacked by Israeli aircraft, which is denounced by the UN. These sad events are yet another detail for Hamas and Israel, which are determined to continue fighting until one of them is defeated, regardless of the cost in lives. Several countries in the region support Hamas and blame Israel for the chaos unleashed. Among these are Iran, Qatar, Algeria, Afghanistan, Yemen and Tunisia. It should also be mentioned that Qatar has financed Hamas since the beginning of the blockade in 2005, sending a total of $2 billion. The same is true of Iran, which provides money and also military training, such as the use of drones with explosives. Turkish President Erdogan tells reporters that he holds Netanyahu personally responsible for the deaths of civilians in Gaza and says that he is no longer someone we can talk to. President Netanyahu, for his part, clarified that the Israeli armed forces would control Gaza after the war and rejected proposals to establish an international force in the Strip. Despite this, the following day an Israeli airstrike hit the Jabalia refugee camp, killing 80 Palestinians. On November 22nd, a 9-day truce was agreed upon, in which, in addition to the ceasefire, Israel released 105 hostages and, for its part, released 240 Palestinians it had imprisoned. In addition, 200 trucks with medicine and food were allowed to enter for the Gazans. After a month and a half of bombing and fighting, the civilian population of Gaza was able to have a brief 9-day respite. At the time of the truce, nearly 300,000 Palestinian homes had been destroyed by Israel and more than 1 million people were displaced, surviving wherever they could. On December 1st, however, both sides resumed fighting with the Israeli army carrying out an incursion into the city of Honduras. This city, located in the south of Gaza, is the second most populous and represents a tough nut to crack for the Israelis. The fighting turns into house-to-house fighting with the guerrillas never hiding in any type of structure. Israeli tanks come under fire from RPG rocket launchers that are fired from all over the streets. The fighting intensifies to the point that it is not possible to send any humanitarian aid. The UN Under-Secretary for Humanitarian Aid confesses that no aid is arriving and that what does arrive is erratically and unsustainably. Hospitals are overwhelmed with supplies and must treat the wounded as best they can. Telephone and internet communications are interrupted by the constant bombardment and chaos. In an atrocious act, the Great Mosque of Gaza, which was 15 years old and was the oldest in the Strip, is destroyed. By mid-December, the UN called for a ceasefire, with 153 countries voting in favor of the truce and only 10 voting against. Prime Minister Netanyahu responded by assuring that he would continue his offensive until the Gaza Strip was over, without international support. In line with this, Israeli forces began flooding the 500 kilometers network of tunnels under Gaza. This network used by Gaza is very extensive and has armored doors, barracks and warehouses. Its complete flooding with seawater, however, could destroy the water system of the entire strip, leading to absolute disaster for civilians. As of mid-December, 18,200 Palestinians had died, of whom 7,729 were children and 5,000 were suspected of being Gaza combatants. The percentage of children and women killed in such a short period of time is unheard of in the 21st century. In fact, in the first 2 months of the current conflict, more women and children were killed by the Israeli army than in the entire first year of the 2003 Iraq War, and roughly the same number as were killed by Allied troops in the 20-year war in Afghanistan. Compared to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, more than twice as many women and children have died in the Gaza Strip in just 2 months than in 2 years of war in Ukraine. These figures are understandable when considering Israel's reckless use of 900-kilogram bombs in densely populated areas, when the bombs most frequently used by the Americans in those conflicts weighed barely 230 kilograms and were already considered excessive. To find a similar situation, one would have to go back to the Vietnam War or even World War II, before the Geneva Conventions existed. On Israel's side, 115 Israeli soldiers were killed in the incursion into Gaza and 16 were wounded. If the October 7th attack is taken into account, some 44 soldiers have died along with 59 police officers, 859 civilians and 40 missing. In this context, it is most likely that Israel will continue its offensive until it takes all of northern Gaza, which could lead to much fiercer fighting. After this, it may launch another much more complex operation to take the southern part, which today is home to 2 million people in just 25 square kilometers. This operation to take southern Gaza could well last several months between fighting and truces to evacuate civilians and would probably end up costing the lives of many Palestinians. The city of Han Yunis is already a sign that Israel intends to take the south of the Strip, leaving civilians squeezed into the city of Rafah, on the border with Egypt. On the other hand, exchanges with the terrorist group Hezbollah, financed by Iran, have been escalating on Israel's northern border, but have not yet fully exploded. Should this front worsen, an invasion like the one in 1982 by Israel in southern Lebanon could perhaps be seen. Despite these projections, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict remains more latent than ever in its more than 100-year history and seems far from over. If you enjoyed the documentary, please consider supporting us on Patreon so that we can continue producing videos about history and current events. A big greeting and until the next video.